The aroma of ginger and scallions drifted from the kitchen, a comforting warmth that settled in Shen Nian's chilled bones. Pei Xinian's apartment, small but meticulously kept, felt like a sanctuary. Sunlight, filtered through the sheer curtains, painted soft patterns on the wooden floor. She sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap, the worn fabric of her dress a stark contrast to the plush cushions beneath her. Each breath was a conscious effort, a small rebellion against the tightness in her chest. She had run. Truly run. Not just from the stifling walls of the Shen family home, but from years of suffocating expectations, of unspoken resentments, of being a ghost in her own life. Pei Xinian emerged from the kitchen, a steaming bowl of noodles in his hands. "Eat something, Nian Nian," he said, his voice gentle, his eyes filled with a concern that warmed her more than the ginger broth. He set the bowl before her, the simple act radiating a care she hadn't experienced in she couldn't remember how long. The noodles, slick with sesame oil and dotted with green onions, looked impossibly delicious. A pang of guilt twisted in her stomach. Such a simple pleasure, yet it felt extravagant, forbidden. At the Shen family table, she was always the last to eat, picking at the leftovers after everyone else had their fill. The best portions, the tenderest meats, were always reserved for Shenhuaner. Even now, the habit of minimizing her needs, of making herself small, lingered. "Uncle," her voice was barely a whisper, raspy from disuse. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I don't deserve this." He sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm. The touch, so casual yet so grounding, sent a tremor through her. "Nonsense, Nian Nian. You deserve the world." His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. It was a look she hadn't received from her adoptive parents, not once in all the years she'd lived under their roof. She picked up her chopsticks, the smooth wood unfamiliar in her trembling hands. The first bite, the savory broth warming her throat, brought a fresh wave of tears. "You've been pleasing the Shen family for so long," Pei Xinian murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "but you haven't even had a full meal." The words, so simple, so true, pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. The dam finally broke. Sobs racked her body, years of suppressed grief pouring out in a torrent. Pei Xinian held her close, his arms a solid, comforting presence. He didn't try to shush her, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply held her, letting her cry until the storm within subsided. In his embrace, she felt a sense of safety, of belonging, that she had never known before. "Uncle," she choked out, burying her face in his shoulder, "in this life, my family only has my uncle." Later, after the tears had dried and the bowl of noodles had been emptied, Shen Nian began to speak, haltingly at first, then with a growing sense of release. She told him everything. The constant belittling, the unfair comparisons to Shenhuaner, the way her achievements were dismissed, her needs ignored. She spoke of the physical chores, the endless errands, the constant feeling of being an outsider in her own home. And then, the most difficult part, the truth about her college entrance exam scores. How they had been stolen, attributed to Shenhuaner, robbing her of her future, her dreams. Pei Xinian listened intently, his face hardening with each revelation. The anger in his eyes, however, wasn't directed at her, but at the Shen family, at the injustice she had endured. "Nian Nian," he said, his voice low and firm, "you don't have to go back there. Ever." The thought, so liberating, so terrifying, filled her with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Could she really leave? Could she sever ties with the only family she had ever known, even if that family had never truly accepted her? But what about my education? The question, whispered into the quiet room, held all her anxieties, her fears for the future. "We'll figure it out," Pei Xinian assured her, his hand squeezing hers reassuringly. You're brilliant, Nian Nian. You deserve to pursue your dreams. And I'll be here to help you every step of the way. His words, filled with such unwavering belief in her, ignited a spark of hope within her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future free from the Shen family's suffocating grasp. A future where she could be herself, where her talents would be recognized, where she would be loved and cherished. The decision, once a terrifying leap into the unknown, now felt like the only possible path. Staying with her uncle, pursuing her education, building a life of her own, it was a daunting prospect, but one filled with a promise of happiness she had never dared to dream of. The confrontation with the Shen family was inevitable. When they arrived at Pei Xinyan's apartment, their faces a mixture of anger and bewilderment. Shen Yan felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly overshadowed by a newfound sense of resolve. She stood beside her uncle, his presence a silent but powerful support. The accusations flew, the denials were vehement. Shen Chang and Song Chunlin, her adoptive parents, initially expressed disbelief, then outrage. Shen Wan'er, her adoptive sister, remained silent, her eyes downcast, a flicker of guilt betraying her carefully composed facade. Shen Huijin, the eldest brother, stood apart, his expression a mixture of shame and regret. The younger brothers, Huili and Huizhou, seemed genuinely bewildered, as if only now realizing the depth of their sister's suffering. But this time, Shen Yan didn't shrink back. She didn't apologize. She spoke her truth, clearly and firmly, her voice resonating with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She recounted the years of neglect, the stolen opportunities, the emotional wounds that had festered for so long. She presented the evidence, undeniable proof of her academic achievements, the scores that had been rightfully hers. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The Shen family's carefully constructed world, built on pretense and denial, began to crumble. The accusations, the denials, the justifications, they all rang hollow in the face of the undeniable truth. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Shen Yan's steady breathing, each inhale a declaration of her newfound freedom. Finally, she looked at them, not with resentment or anger, but with a quiet sadness. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm not your daughter. I never was." And with those words, she turned and walked away, leaving behind the shadows of the past, stepping into the light of her own future. The stale scent of mothballs clung to the air in the utility room, a smell Shen Yan had come to associate with loneliness. Sunlight, fractured and weak, filtered through a high, grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the perpetual twilight. She traced a finger along the cracked paint of the wall, a habit born of boredom and a desperate need for tactile comfort. 200 yuan a month, the words echoed in her mind, a cruel mockery of what her life could have been. 200 yuan. Enough for a decent meal, a warm coat, a stack of books. Enough to feel human. But that money, like so many other things, had never reached her. A memory, sharp and painful, pierced through the present. She was 12, huddled in the corner of this very room, stomach cramping with hunger. The aroma of braised pork wafted from the kitchen, a tantalizing torment. She dared to ask Shen Wan'er, her adoptive sister, for a small portion. Wan'er, dressed in a frilly pink dress, had wrinkled her nose. "This is imported pork, Nian. You wouldn't appreciate it." The dismissive flick of Wan'er's wrist, the casual cruelty in her tone, these were the wounds that festered deeper than any physical deprivation. The scene shifted. She was 15, scrubbing the kitchen floor while the rest of the family enjoyed a boisterous New Year's Eve dinner. Firecrackers exploded in the distance, their joyous pops a stark contrast to the hollowness in her chest. She'd overheard Shen Chang, her adoptive father, boasting to a guest about his children's achievements, conveniently omitting any mention of her existence. Warner is excelling in piano. Huijin is a star athlete. We're so blessed. Blessed. The word tasted like ash in Shenyan's memory. Back in the stifling present of the utility room, the weight of years of accumulated neglect pressed down on her. The chipped teacup she used, the threadbare blanket, the silence that had become her constant companion, each object, each absence, was a testament to her invisibility within the Shen family. 200 yuan a month, Pei Xinyan's voice, laced with disbelief and anger, cut through the haze of her memories. He stood in the doorway, his usually gentle face hardened with a protective fury. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and understanding that warmed the frozen wasteland within her. "Nian, tell me everything." The words tumbled out, a torrent of suppressed pain finally finding release. She spoke of the meager meals, the constant chores, the verbal barbs disguised as jokes, the cold indifference that had chipped away at her self-worth. With each revelation, the expressions on the faces of the assembled Shen family members shifted. Disbelief warred with dawning comprehension, guilt gnawed at the edges of their carefully constructed facade. Shen Huijin, her eldest adoptive brother, shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. His usual arrogance had been replaced by a disconcerting unease. He knew, Shen Yan realized, a cold knot forming in her stomach. He knew, and he did nothing. Shen Huili, the second brother, remained stoic, his expression unreadable. A flicker of something akin to annoyance crossed his features, as though he considered this whole affair a tedious interruption. He was the master of detached indifference, a skill honed over years of ignoring her presence. Shen Chang and Song Chunlin, her adoptive parents, wore masks of stunned incredulity. This can't be true," Song Chunlin stammered, her voice trembling. "We provided for you. We gave you a home." A bitter laugh escaped Shen Yan's lips. "A home? This storage room?" While Warner enjoyed a spacious bedroom, a wardrobe full of designer clothes, and endless praise. The mention of Warner's name brought a flicker of fear to her adoptive sister's eyes. Until this moment, Warner had maintained an air of bewildered innocence, but now, a crack appeared in her carefully crafted facade. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some flimsy excuse, but the words died in her throat. The turning point, the final blow that shattered the fragile remnants of their pretense, came with the revelation of her college entrance exam score. "The university they called," Pei Xinyan said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "They wanted to confirm Shen Yan's details. They couldn't find her records." A heavy silence descended upon the room. Shen Chang cleared his throat, his face pale. "There must be some mistake. Nian didn't perform well. She scored among the top 10 in the province," Pei Xinyan countered, his voice resonating with quiet power. "A score that would guarantee her a place in any prestigious university. A score that mysteriously vanished from the records. The truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating." Shen Warner's admission to a second-tier university suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. The whispers, the hushed phone calls, the sudden influx of money, the pieces clicked into place, forming a sickeningly clear picture. "We haven't heard of anyone named Shen Yan," Song Chunlin repeated, the words now devoid of their initial disbelief, replaced with a chillingly pragmatic coldness. Shen Yan looked at them, her heart a hollow ache in her chest. These people, the ones who were supposed to be her family, had erased her, not just from their affections, but from her very future. A profound sense of detachment washed over her. The anger, the hurt, the yearning for acceptance, it all faded, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "it's time for Shen Yan to disappear completely." She turned to Pei Xinyan, a flicker of genuine warmth finally breaking through the ice in her eyes. "Let's go, uncle." And with that, she walked out of the Shen family home, leaving behind the ghosts of a life she had never truly lived. The scent of mothballs, the cracked paint, the suffocating silence, they were no longer her burden to bear. She was free. The humid Jiangnan air hung heavy, clinging to the skin like a damp cloth. The cacophony of cicadas thrummed in the background, a relentless drone punctuated by the excited chatter of students crowding around the announcement board at Jiangda High School affiliated middle school. A sea of anxious faces, a kaleidoscope of anticipation and dread, reflected in the glass that encased the freshly posted results. Shen Yan stood apart, a solitary figure in the swirling vortex of emotion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wasn't sure what she expected. Hope felt like a dangerous indulgence, a fragile butterfly easily crushed by the weight of reality. She'd studied relentlessly, fueled by a desperate need to escape, to carve out a future beyond the suffocating confines of the Shen family. But what if it wasn't enough? A tremor ran through the crowd. A collective gasp rippled outwards, followed by a rising tide of whispers. Someone shouted, 720. Someone got 720. The highest score in the country. Shen Yan felt a strange detachment, as if watching a scene unfold in slow motion. The numbers blurred before her eyes, meaningless digits swimming in a sea of ink. Then, a name. Her name. Shen Yan. Top of the list. 720. The air thickened in her lungs, stealing her breath. This couldn't be real. A dizzying wave of disbelief washed over her, followed by a surge of something she hadn't felt in years: pride. Raw, untainted pride in herself. She had done it. Alone. The celebratory banquet, held in the school's grand auditorium, felt like a distorted dream. The opulent chandeliers cast a shimmering glow on the polished marble floor, reflecting the forced smiles and polite chatter of parents and teachers. Shen Yan's arrival caused a ripple in the carefully orchestrated atmosphere. Shen Chang and Song Chunlin, her adoptive parents, stared at her with a mixture of bewilderment and something that looked disturbingly like resentment. Shen Wan'er, her adoptive sister, averted her gaze, a flicker of guilt crossing her perfectly composed features. Shen Yan felt their eyes on her, scrutinizing, assessing. Like appraisers evaluating a newly discovered antique. Shen Huijin, the eldest of her three adoptive brothers, approached her, his expression a complex tapestry of guilt and pride. Nian Nian, he began, his voice low and hesitant, congratulations. We didn't expect, he trailed off, unable to articulate the tangled web of emotions swirling within him. Shen Yan met his gaze, her own unwavering. The years of subtle slights, the constant comparisons to Shen Wan'er, the unspoken dismissal of her achievements, it all resurfaced, a bitter tide washing over her. Didn't expect, she echoed, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor that ran through her. Her words, though soft, cut through the celebratory din like a shard of glass. No, I suppose you didn't. You were too busy ensuring Wan'er's success to notice mine. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations. Shen Chang cleared his throat, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Nian Nian, what are you saying? We've always treated you, he faltered, unable to finish the lie. Song Chunlin stepped forward, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that grated on Shen Yan's nerves. Nian Nian, don't be silly. We're all so proud of you. The words felt hollow, devoid of genuine warmth. Shen Yan closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. This was it. The moment she had been rehearsing in her mind for years. She opened her eyes, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her adoptive family. Each one held a mirror to the years of neglect, the subtle cruelties that had chipped away at her sense of self. I got 720 points, she announced, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity, cutting through the forced gaiety of the banquet hall. The chatter subsided, replaced by a stunned silence. She met their gazes, one by one, holding their attention captive. The first in the country, she continued, each word a hammer blow against the fragile facade of their familial harmony. And from now on, she declared, her voice rising with each syllable, I will cut off all ties with your Shen family. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. A collective gasp swept through the room. Shen Chang's face turned ashen. Song Chunlin's carefully crafted mask of composure crumbled, revealing the shock and disbelief beneath. Shen Wan'er stared at her, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Even Shen Huaijin and his younger brothers, Shen Huaili and Shen Huaizhou, who had begun to understand the depth of their complicity, looked at her with a dawning comprehension of the irreparable damage they had inflicted. The banquet hall, once filled with the murmur of polite conversation, was now suffocatingly silent. Shen Yan felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her, a quiet peace that she hadn't known she craved. The weight of their expectations, their judgments, their indifference it all lifted, leaving her feeling strangely light, free. She turned and walked away, leaving the wreckage of their carefully constructed world behind her. The cicadas outside continued their relentless chorus, a soundtrack to her newfound freedom. The future stretched before her, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the colors of her own choosing. And for the first time in a long time, Shen Yan felt a flicker of hope. A fragile, tentative hope, but hope nonetheless. It bloomed in her chest, a small but persistent flame in the darkness. The air in the Shen family home hung thick with a silence heavier than grief. It was the silence of fractured bonds, of unspoken accusations hanging in the dust motes dancing in the weak afternoon light. Shen Chang sat slumped on the ornate sofa, his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than bone. He'd aged 10 years in the span of a few days. Beside him, Song Chunlin clutched a tissue, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. Shen Wan'er, usually vibrant and demanding, sat unusually still, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the carpet, a flicker of something akin to guilt in her downcast eyes. They were waiting. Waiting for Shen Yan. Waiting for a forgiveness they didn't deserve. The phone lay on the coffee table between them, a cold, metallic rectangle that held the undeniable evidence of their cruelty, their neglect. The videos, the messages, the sheer volume of unanswered pleas, a damning testament to their failure as parents, as human beings. The doorbell chimed, a sharp, discordant sound in the oppressive stillness. Song Chunlin flinched, her hand flying to her chest. Shen Chang rose slowly, his legs heavy, his movements stiff. He opened the door to reveal Shen Yan, flanked by her uncle, Pei Sinian. Shen Yan stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her adoptive family. There was no warmth in her eyes, only a chilling detachment. She had seen the videos, the messages. The raw, ugly truth of their disregard had stripped away any lingering vestiges of hope, leaving behind a desolate emptiness. They never truly saw me, she thought, the realization a dull ache in her chest. I was a ghost in this house. Pei Xinyan's presence radiated a quiet strength, a protective shield around Shen Yan. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We won't stay long, he said, his voice calm but firm. Shen Chang cleared his throat, the sound raspy. Nian Nian, we are so sorry. The words felt hollow even to his own ears. He wanted to reach for her, to beg for forgiveness, but the chasm between them seemed insurmountable. Shen Yan remained silent, her eyes fixed on Shen Chang. She saw the remorse in his eyes, but it couldn't erase the years of neglect, the countless moments of casual cruelty that had chipped away at her soul. Is this what they call regret, she wondered. Does it even matter now? Song Chunlin began to weep, her sobs echoing in the silent room. Please, Nian Nian, she pleaded, forgive us. We didn't realize we didn't know, Shen Nian thought, a bitter laugh catching in her throat. How could you not know? The phone on the table seemed to pulsate, a silent accusation. Shen Nian's gaze shifted to Shen Wan'er. Her adoptive sister avoided her eyes, her face pale. A complex mix of emotions churned within Shen Nian: resentment, anger, and a strange, unsettling pity. The tension in the room was palpable, a suffocating blanket. Shen Nian took a deep breath, steeling herself. There's nothing to forgive, she said, her voice quiet but steady. We are not a family. We never were. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Shen Chang's face crumpled. Song Chunlin's sobs intensified. Shen Wan'er finally looked up, her eyes wide with a dawning comprehension of the irrevocable damage. Later, at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. Shen Huaijin lay in bed, his face pale, his arm bandaged. He'd been involved in a car accident, a reckless act born of guilt and self-recrimination. He had seen the videos on the phone, the undeniable evidence of his own complicity in Shen Nian's suffering. His silence, his indifference, they had been as damaging as the outright cruelty. Shen Nian stood by his bedside, her expression unreadable. She felt a flicker of something, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement of his pain. It's all my fault, Shen Huaijin whispered, his voice hoarse. I hurt you, I should have protected you. His eyes met hers, pleading for understanding. Shen Nian looked at him, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He's hurting, she acknowledged, but his pain doesn't erase mine. I have never known anyone from the Shen family, she said, the words a stark declaration of severance. She turned and walked away, leaving Shen Huaijin alone with his guilt and regret. The sterile white walls of the hospital seemed to close in on him, mirroring the suffocating weight of his remorse. Back at the Pei family home, Shen Nian sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The events of the past few days had left her emotionally drained, but there was also a sense of liberation. The ties that had bound her to the Shen family, ties forged not of love but of obligation and abuse, were finally broken. Pei Sinian entered the room, carrying a cup of tea. He sat beside her, his presence a comforting anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. You did the right thing, Nian Nian, he said softly. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his unwavering support. It hurts, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I know, he said, his hand gently stroking her hair. But it will get better. You are safe now. You are home. Home, Shen Nian thought, the word resonating deep within her. It wasn't a place, but a feeling, a sense of belonging, of unconditional love and acceptance. It was a feeling she had never experienced in the Shen family home, but one she was finally beginning to find within herself, within the embrace of her true family. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Shen Nian felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember glowing in the darkness of her past. The truth, no matter how painful, had set her free. And in that freedom, she found the strength to begin again. The crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering, almost ethereal glow across the ballroom. A sea of silk and satin, of polite smiles and clinking champagne flutes, swayed to the rhythm of the string quartet. Shen Nian stood in the wings, the hushed anticipation a tangible pressure against her chest. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as they rested on the cool, polished wood of the piano. This wasn't the grand Steinway she'd dreamt of playing, but it would suffice. Tonight, the music wasn't for her. It was a message, a swan song, a final, piercing note in the discordant symphony of her life with the Shen family. Pei Sinian squeezed her shoulder gently, his presence a silent reassurance in the swirling vortex of her emotions. "Ready?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble that somehow cut through the ambient noise. She nodded, not trusting her voice, her throat constricted by the unspoken words that clawed at her insides. As she walked onto the stage, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The faces in the crowd blurred, a kaleidoscope of indifferent smiles. Shen Yan saw them, yet she didn't see them. Her focus narrowed to the ivory keys beneath her fingertips. This was it. Her final act. The opening chords of the melody resonated through the ballroom, a haunting cascade of notes that silenced the idle chatter. The piece was her own composition, a piece she'd poured her heart and soul into, a piece that Shenhwana had claimed as her own for the college entrance exam, the piece that had cemented Shenhwana's perceived brilliance and further relegated Shen Yan to the shadows. As the music swelled, filling the vast space with its melancholic beauty, Shen Yan saw her adoptive brothers, Shen Huijin, Shen Huili, and Shen Huizhou, stiffen in their seats. Their faces, usually masks of careless indifference, contorted with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. They knew this music. They had heard Shen Yan play it countless times in the desolate solitude of her small room, a room she had mistakenly thought of as a sanctuary. Shen Yan closed her eyes, losing herself in the music, in the raw emotion it conveyed. Each note was a tear, each chord a scream against the injustice and neglect she had endured. The melody shifted, becoming more urgent, more insistent, mirroring the rising tide of her own resolve. When the final note faded, a stunned silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft intake of breath. Then, applause erupted, polite and appreciative, but for Shen Yan, it was a hollow sound. She had played not for their approval, but for her liberation. As she walked off stage, Pei Sinian met her with a look of pride mixed with concern. He knew what this performance meant, the finality of it. Before he could speak, she was intercepted. Shen Huijin stood before her, his face etched with a pain she hadn't seen before. "Shen Yan," he began, his voice thick with emotion. We didn't know." The words felt empty, hollow echoes in the vast chamber of her resentment. "Didn't know." She echoed his words, a bitter taste rising in her throat. "Or didn't care to know." Shen Huili and Shen Huizhou joined their brother, their expressions mirroring his remorse. They stammered apologies, words of regret and belated understanding. They spoke of how they had been blind, how they had failed her, how they now saw the depth of their complicity in her suffering. Shen Yan looked at them, a chilling emptiness settling in her heart. Their apologies, however sincere, were too late. The wounds they had inflicted ran too deep. "Do you think words can erase years of neglect?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. Shen Huijin reached out a hand towards her, a gesture of supplication, but she flinched away. The physical recoil was involuntary, a visceral reaction to years of ingrained emotional distance. He retracted his hand, his face a mask of despair. A sudden hush fell over the small group as Shen Chang and Song Chunlin approached, their faces a mixture of confusion and apprehension. The applause for Shen Yan's performance had reached them, stirring an uneasy awareness of the undercurrents swirling beneath the surface of the gala's glittering facade. They had heard whispers, fragments of conversations about Shen Yan's music, about Shenhwana's deception. "Nian Nian," Song Chunlin began, her voice trembling slightly, "what is the meaning of this?" Shen Yan met her gaze, her eyes reflecting a chilling composure. "The meaning, mother," she said, the word dripping with irony, "is quite simple. The creator of this piece is Shen Yan. The piece Shenhwana submitted for the college entrance exam, the piece that earned her so much praise it was mine." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. The shock on Shen Chang and Song Chunlin's faces was palpable, quickly replaced by a defensive anger. They began to protest, to deny, to deflect blame, their voices rising above the polite murmur of the gala. Shen Yan watched them, a strange detachment washing over her. She had expected this, anticipated their denial, their refusal to acknowledge the depth of their failings. It no longer mattered. She had said her piece, played her final note. She turned to Pei Sinian, a small, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm, resolute. He nodded, his hand gently resting on her back as they turned and walked away. As they moved through the crowd, Shen Yan paused, her back to her adoptive family. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the ambient noise. "From today on," she declared, each word a hammer blow shattering the remaining shards of their fractured relationship, "I have nothing to do with the Shen family." And with that, she walked away, leaving behind the gilded cage of their suffocating love, stepping into the unknown, but free. The silence that followed her departure was deafening, broken only by the muffled sobs of Song Chunlin and the stunned whispers of the onlookers. For Shen Yan, it was the sound of liberation. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, painting shifting patterns on the polished wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the golden rays, a silent ballet in the stillness of the Pei family home. Shen Yan traced the outline of a leaf on the windowpane, her breath fogging the cool glass. It was a simple act, yet it held a weight of peace she hadn't known existed. Here, in her uncle's home, the silence wasn't oppressive, but a gentle blanket of tranquility. She wasn't Shen Yan, the unwanted burden, the shadow in the Shen household. Here, she was simply Nian Nian, her uncle's cherished niece. The memories of the Shen house were a dull ache, a persistent phantom limb. She recalled the echoing emptiness of her room, the cold indifference in their eyes. The constant comparisons to Shenwana, the favored daughter, the bright star in their family constellation. Here, there were no comparisons, no whispers of inadequacy. Her uncle saw her, truly saw her, the person beneath the scars they had inflicted. He nurtured her wounded spirit with a tenderness that both soothed and terrified her. Could she truly deserve this kindness after the years of neglect? Days melted into weeks, weeks into months. The rigid lines of tension etched on her face began to soften. Laughter, once a stranger, became a frequent visitor. She learned to breathe again, deep, unburdened breaths that filled her lungs with the clean, crisp air of freedom. Her uncle, Pei Sinian, watched her transformation with a quiet joy that mirrored her own. He'd brought her books, encouraging her to rediscover the world beyond the confines of the Shen family's suffocating expectations. He enrolled her in classes, nurturing the spark of creativity she'd kept hidden for so long. "Nian Nian," he'd say, his voice a warm rumble, "you are a phoenix rising from the ashes. Don't let anyone dim your light." His words were a balm to her wounded soul, a constant reassurance against the lingering whispers of doubt that still haunted her. The legal battles with the Shen family were a distant storm, handled with quiet efficiency by her uncle's lawyers. She barely registered the details, choosing instead to focus on the blossoming life before her. The news of her exceptional college entrance exam score, a score so high it was the talk of the city, barely registered. It felt like a relic from a past life, a life she was determined to leave behind. The truth, however, was a twisted irony, a secret she carried like a stone in her pocket. The exam, it hadn't been her. It had been Shen Huijin, her eldest adoptive brother, taking the test in her name. A desperate attempt to appease their parents, to secure their favor, to finally, perhaps, acknowledge her existence. The irony was a bitter pill, a testament to the twisted dynamics of the Shen family. But even that revelation, with its potential to shatter her newfound peace, couldn't penetrate the protective shield her uncle had woven around her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, Shen Yan found her uncle in his study. The room, lined with books, smelled of old paper and leather, a scent that had become synonymous with safety and comfort. He looked up from his work, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "Come in, Nien Nien," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "What brings you here?" She hesitated at the doorway, clutching a small velvet box in her hand. The weight of unspoken words pressed against her chest. "Uncle," she began, her voice barely a whisper, I have something for you." He watched her approach, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She placed the box on his desk, her fingers lingering on the smooth velvet. "It's your birthday next week," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, "and I wanted to give you something." He opened the box, his gaze falling on the exquisite diamond ring nestled within. The stones, arranged in a delicate crown motif, shimmered in the lamplight. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and affection. "Nien Nien," he breathed, this is too much." "No," she said, her voice firm, "it's not. You promised to give me the most expensive birthday present in the world when I turned 18. You gave me a home, a family, a life. This is nothing compared to what you've given me." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of gratitude, of love, of a profound sense of belonging she had never known before. "This ring," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "it's called the crown. It's priceless, like you." He reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch sent a wave of comfort through her. "Nien Nien," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are my crown jewel." In that moment, the last vestiges of the Shen family's hold on her evaporated. She was no longer defined by their rejection, by their neglect. She was Shen Yan, a young woman forging her own path, surrounded by love and acceptance. She was finally free. The following days were a blur of activity. She packed her belongings, carefully selecting the few items that held meaning for her. The rest, the remnants of her life with the Shen family, she left behind without a backward glance. She visited the Shen house one last time, a silent farewell to the ghosts of her past. The house felt empty, devoid of the life she had once imagined existed within its walls. Shen Chang and Song Chunlin, her adoptive parents, sat in the living room, their faces etched with a mixture of guilt and regret. Shen Wana hovered in the background, her expression unreadable. Shen Huijin and Shen Huizhou stood by the window, their eyes filled with a silent apology. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge their presence. There were no words left to say. The ties that had bound them, however tenuous, were severed. She turned and walked away, leaving the echoes of their silence behind her. As she stepped out